You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Shalom, this is Dr. Jennifer Noonan, and I want to welcome you to this week's episode of SLA Insights. I'm continuing a discussion on output. In previous episodes, I've talked about the mental processes that are involved in producing output. I've talked about the output hypothesis. And in the previous episode, the most recent one, I gave an overview of the different ways in which output can promote language acquisition and how it helps, especially in a refining role as learners acquire language. Now, input may be essential, but output has a role to play, and it can do many things. This week, I'm going to focus on how it promotes the depth of learning or depth of acquisition of the language. So what we're looking at here, when we're talking output, it promotes language acquisition in a way that active learning is better than passive learning, or productive learning is more effective than receptive learning. And so most would agree that an active learner is going to learn more deeply than a passive learner. Similarly, productive learning is preferable to receptive learning if you were looking at depth. And so we're going to look at how output production can enable acquisition directly by engaging syntactic processing in a way that comprehension does not. And that is a direct quote from Rod Ellis and is corroborated by many others, including Peter Skehan. So we're looking at ways that output can help promote acquisition by making the learner process the language data more deeply. So before we get into more specifics for language learning, I want to give you a few analogous examples from other areas of learning. So for example, if you are actively learning algebra, you are engaging in deeper syntactic processing when you solve algebraic equations. This is going to take you beyond the theory into active processing. So the process of applying the theory to an actual math problem makes your brain work harder, and the theory is more likely to stick or be acquired because you've used it. Now, a similar example, when you were learning to read, your teacher probably had you learn to spell words. Now think about it. It is quite possible to read the English language without knowing how to spell. You can recognize the words, and you can understand, in most cases, what you're reading. But if you can spell, even your receptive knowledge of English is going to be that much better. You're going to be able to decode and recognize words more quickly. Your word recognition is going to be faster, and in most cases more precise. And you're going to understand the difference between homonyms, for example, two and two in English, or there and there, or no and no. Those things, because you've had to deal with them and learn how to spell them, you are able to recognize and understand them better. And so spelling, as you might imagine, is, as you've probably experienced, is harder than reading. It requires deeper syntactic processing. And the result is the language is more internalized because you've gone through that process. A similar thing happens when you're learning a second language. You must have a stronger grasp of the forms and the vocabulary to successfully produce output than you do to comprehend input at the same level. Okay, so let's take, for example, one learner, we'll call him Aaron, and he has a receptive knowledge of Greek. He can read and comprehend sentences in Greek. So he recognizes the words, vocabulary. He recognizes and understands the significance of the noun declension. He recognizes verbal forms and can parse them accurately. He may or may not recognize the significance of the syntax or word order. As long as he can find a subject, verb, and object, he can get a pretty good idea and translate that sentence, understand, comprehend the sentence. Now let's consider another learner, call him Benjamin, and he's able to speak at the same level that Aaron can comprehend. If he's going to do that, he has to move beyond not just recognizing the vocabulary, but he's got to be able to retrieve it when he needs it. He is not just recognizing the noun endings and the declension and assigning the correct meaning, but he's got to filter through the various parts of speech. Is this a nominative? Is it an accusative? Is this a dative? And then which of the noun declension patterns am I supposed to use for this particular word? And has to choose the right one, of course. Not just able to recognize and parse the verbs, but choose the correct verbal form for communicating his intended meaning in that given situation. We're talking tense, we're talking person, number, conjugations. He's got to be able to access all of that and choose the right one for that situation. And then be able to string them all together in a coherent and meaningful way, in the right order, in a way that communicates what he's trying to communicate. Now, you need to understand that takes a lot more brain power and a lot more understanding of the language to be able to do it. And it takes serious, in the words of Ellis, syntactic processing to do it. But when he does, the language is embedded that much more deeply into his developing system, and he really knows the language at that point. Another example, analogous example, is perhaps the difference between taking a multiple choice test in the case of just recognizing and comprehending versus an essay test where you have to retrieve the items, put them together in a coherent way. You have no clues or cues for what you need to put in that blank except the question itself. And so you understand that this output requires a lot more mental processing. And in doing so, the learner acquires the language that much more deeply. And then, so the net effect then is pushing the learner to process on a deeper level than they would if they were just comprehending, with the result of more language acquisition. So for those of you who are students, look for ways to produce output. Look for ways to speak the language in a meaningful context. And for instructors, same thing, looking for opportunities to produce language, understanding a couple things. One is you have to have the input first. You cannot produce what you have not heard or learned or read or seen already. If you have not acquired the form, you will not be able to use it in output. The other thing to keep in mind is that the level of output is going to be significantly lower than the level of input or comprehension that your students can use. And so give them plenty of input to start the process, get them acquiring, processing, and then go back. And you're going to have to go maybe a couple weeks worth of material back to get them producing output. But when they do, it's going to push them to learn that material that much more deeply and really have a handle on the forms, the functions, what they mean, when to use them, how to use them. So, in conclusion, this is the first role of output that we're talking on a deeper level, that output promotes depth of learning or depth of acquisition. Next week, we're going to look at how output promotes and helps to build automaticity in language acquisition. I hope you can join me for the next episode. In the meantime, have a great week.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.